Hello everyone, today we talk about 12th century Pisan warfare. This is the first regional warfare series that we start for a maritime republic, whose military activity is actually as important at sea as on land, especially as centuries go by. In fact, we will see this especially in the 13th and 14th. In any case, the history of the Italian communes, I noticed this online, mostly revolves around the idea of the maritime republics. And there is this overemphasis on a mercantile character that, frankly, however, these cities that were heading toward a proper statehood were only having in the measure. They were naturally enormously profiting, especially at this point, from their naval power. But in fact, this is exactly the point. They were pretty successful, but they would never represent themselves as mercantile republics as such, like a Flemish town run by third estaters under a feudal authority would be something similar to that. Communes had, of course, a popular bias in a way, but these communities are very rigidly hierarchical, pretty solidly stratified, and in the case of the maritime ones in particular, you have a much greater sort of proactivity that gets often, in this sense, perhaps missed in its importance as far as the amount of wealth reinvested at sea is concerned. Right, we'll see this better for the 14th century, but the sheer costs that the Italians had in naval activities, something staggering. Had they been spent for, say, land forces, would have seen even more than the fundamentally most military active region in Europe did at the time. And in fact, it can't but be seen at sea through their naval activity, military operations on the waves. All right, so we'll naturally talk about other maritime republics. We never did really for this era any video about Venice, for example. We will talk about Venice starting from the 13th, but militarily speaking from the 14th century, or maybe something also before, but mostly stretching, say, between the 11th to 13th. We have to get a bit more specific, because really without evenemential history, you can't really understand what this was all about and the scale by which, by the way, these communes are incomprehensibly underrepresented, right? It's not like they are underrepresented because at the end of the day, they're sort of marginally in the picture. They were truly the strongest powers in Europe, even as single cities, and not merely in a metaphorical sense or in a provocative one either, right? They literally were capable of fielding armies as big as the ones of the great feudal monarchies in the West, individually, alone, even without leagues. And in the case of Pisa, this is particularly the case because today we will get to learn the city a bit better, made a series from the regional type on Pisa in two episodes, right? However, when we should start calling them volumes. So if you're particularly curious about the military development of this Tuscan maritime republic during the 13th and the 14th century, you'll find out that the Pisans fielded at the beginning of the 14th century, so the peak of medieval civilization, likely the single most tactically advanced army in Europe, for reasons that are not even published, right? And we will surely cover on Schwerpunkt. But we stick today to the 12th century. As you understand from the length of the video already, there's really a lot to say. In fact, the Republic of Pisa entered the 12th century as a rising maritime power whose naval strength and commercial ambitions shaped its military engagements across the Mediterranean. We recently made a video about 11th century Genoese warfare that also recounts some Pisan one, given that there were alliances and wars between these two cities that were pretty close and in the central western Mediterranean, definitely with overlapping interests that would bring both to cooperation and conflict. So I can't say you can follow Pisan warfare from the Genoese video, but let's say there is something there if you're interested. Located at the mouth of the Arno River, which provided a natural harbor protected from the open sea by its position and access to inland trade routes connecting Tuscany northward through the Apennine passes and southward toward Rome, and the Papal territories, as well as eastward into the Italian interior. This is a very specific character. Pisa was the only maritime republic to have a continental ambition. Only Venice at the end of the Middle Ages creates a terra firma, but the Pisans are historically routinely engaged in the Tuscan hinterland with pretty sort of identical warfare to the one, in fact, of other terrestrial communes. Pisa had ancient Roman roots. This is something that emerges also from her Ghibellinism. The Pisans, more than other communes in Italy, possibly more than anybody, other than Rome itself perhaps, has traumatic Roman identity, right? And will historically align with the Holy Roman imperial policy, so much so that it created very numerous, if anything, enemies. Also considering that by controlling the Arno mouth, the Tuscan civilization of the hinterland, that, as you know, was also a pretty prolific one, depended fundamentally on the grain imports from Pisa, or alternative routes that, in any case, were much less practical and therefore fostered pretty intense hatred against the Pisans. Dante, for example, is a pretty vocal opponent of the Maritime Republic. As a Florentine, that's kind of obvious. In fact, we also made a series on Florence in which you realize how long and how much the Florentines and the Pisans fought against one another. It's only at this point that Florence starts becoming fundamentally more important than Pisa, not yet at the beginning of this period. And Pisa had this ancient Roman roots as a naval outpost established during, in fact, the Republic in empire eras for controlling Tyrrhenian shipping lanes. It had evolved into a key early medieval port through centuries of gradual development after the disruptions of the Lombard invasions, that at some point seized some Byzantine dromons from the local port. And there's this important Byzantine connection that makes, for example, lots of manuscripts from Greek, including the ones used to revive Roman law using Bologna, passing through Pisa, as a matter of fact, including the establishment of shipyards along the river banks capable of constructing large galleys suited for both commerce, carrying bulk goods over long distances, and warfare, with reinforced hulls for ramming and decks for marine combatants. This strategic position fostered shipbuilding traditions that emphasized durable, agile vessels powered by oars for maneuverability in coastal waters and calms, combined with lateen sails for efficient long-distance voyaging against prevailing Mediterranean winds, along with extensive trade networks extending from the Tyrrhenian Sea to North Africa, the Levant, and beyond. If you're interested in some kind of seamanship, I made a video about the various type of sails from antiquity to the Middle Ages, the development of the Latin triangular one over centuries. So there is a rich history that we'll surely cover from a military standpoint of Pisa from the previous centuries. It's not like these republics sprang up out of nothing. Pisa was historically, in antiquity also, a more important city than Genoa. All right. Now, these networks involved the exchange of goods, such as Tuscan timber from inland forests for ship construction, salt harvested from coastal pans for preserving meat and fish in an age without reliable refrigeration, silver mined from Sardinian deposits for minting coinage that facilitated transactions across currencies, high-quality textiles woven in Italian workshops, and spices, silks, and dyes imported from Eastern markets via caravan and sea routes to meet European demand for luxury items. If anything, we already have lots of videos about the trade activities of the Italian communes that, as we were saying at the beginning, are a bit more the more remembered ones, but there is a thick political, military, and social history here to untangle, including, for example, the Pisan dominance of Sardinia. That is a major chapter we never tackle in Schwerpunkt, but it is really a glorious one for the history of the city. Pisa had already established supremacy in the Tyrrhenian Sea through earlier alliances and conquests against Saracen forces. They were stronger than the Genoese, right? even though cooperating with them. The Saracens, as you know, were Islamic raiders and rulers, often operating as independent taifas or under broader dynasties like the Zirids, operating from bases in North Africa, such as Ifriqiya itself, today's Tunisia essentially, Sicily under Kalbid emirs. This in the previous centuries, the Normans are already there. I have something coming on that as well, by the way. And the Iberian Peninsula, the Al-Andalus, that was also the main financer of these proxies, fundamentally. That were in North Africa some proper political territorial dominations were consolidating at a provincial level, but there is the Reconquista here going on. The peasants, the Genoese, are involved also in the eastern Spanish coastlines to, in fact, take over with naval blockade the Saracen, the Moorish avamposts besieged from land by the Spanish. These Islamic powers had frequently disrupted, as you know, Christian shipping and coastal settlements through hit-and-run galley raids aimed at capturing slaves, plunder, and disrupting trade. In coordination with Genoa, the other emerging maritime republic on the Ligurian coast, with its own naval capabilities centered on its protected harbor and growing fleet of agile galleys, Pisa secured Sardinia in 1016. Let's be clear, like they didn't take over the entire island. It was satisfactory to just control the main coastal centers, and then the hinterland would essentially be dependent on that for the exports, right? It's a very complicated history behind that, and I recently made a video about the Judicate of Arborea that tells a bit the story, but that was, I think, the only independent Sardinian history video that I've ever made, so we need definitely more. Today we will, if anything, indirectly, partially see some of this. Joint fleets defeated, so Genoese peasant fleets defeated the Islamic rulers Mujahid al-ʿāmirī, also known as Mogahid or Musetto in Latin sources, a powerful Taifa lord from Denia in Islamic Spain, part of the fragmented post-caliphate of Cordoba territories. His raids had in fact disrupted Christian shipping lanes and coastal communities across the western Mediterranean by targeting merchant vessels for cargoes and raiding ports for captives sold into slavery and portable wealth. This victory achieved through coordinated naval battles involving ramming tactics to disable enemy hulls, followed by spurring, that had been the evolution historically, by boarding actions with armed marines using swords, spears, and crossbows, and subsequent landings to secure key positions opened the Sardinian Judicates, the semi-autonomous Christian principalities such as Cagliari in the south with its strategic southern harbors, and Gallura in the northeast with access to eastern trade routes to Pisan influence. Precious metals were the great effect El Dorado of the Pisans at this point. In fact, this included resource extraction from mines in the interior that provided valuable metal for local coinage, strengthening Pisa's economic independence, and broader Mediterranean trade. Salt pans alongside the coast, as we were saying before, essential for food preservation and export as a high-demand commodity. Normally, galleys at this point were packed in biscuits that were the more sort of physical and calories efficient way to feed the crews. And agricultural lands that supplied grain for bread, especially from the south of Sardinia, the hinterland was being pretty nightmarish, right? Livestock for meat and labor, in fact, from the pastoral communities of the hinterland, and other staples. These bolstered the Pisan Republic's economy by ensuring food security for its growing urban population. Sardinia, just as Sicily and Africa had, as you know, historically been used also by Rome to feed her mob. So there is something similar here happening with the Italian urban civilization of the Middle Ages. You can imagine sieges, poor harvests, like the general instability of the times, requiring this secure supply system, logistical lines, and also generating export revenues that funded further naval construction and military campaigns. Right? There is an incredibly large amount of reinvestment of resources that are also fairly well documented if you study diplomatics, if you general paleography, codicology, there is really a lot from Pisa. It was a highly literate, highly civilized community. By the mid-11th century, Pisa asserted control over Corsica as well, through naval expeditions that secured essential timber supplies, particularly pine for masts and oak for sturdy hulls and oars, critical resources in an era when ship timbers wore out rapidly from repeated Mediterranean voyages exposed to saltwater storms and teredo worms, along with strategic island bases that served as way stations for patrols, resupply of water and provisions, and forward operating positions. That galleys had just that given amount of stopping points in some parts, for example, of the Adriatic. We have studies on development of Dalmatian coastal centers that are suspiciously at a day of galley sailing away, rowing away from one another, right? For a reason, evidently. And so these territories in the Corsica and Sardinia reduced dependence on mainland resources as well, vulnerable to rival interference or blockades. This also led the foundational naval expertise in seamanship, including navigation by stars and coastal landmarks, considered the so-called portolanii. That cartography is born exactly in these cities: Pisa, Genoa, Barcelona. That's where the first mappe mundi are properly drawn, mostly for these strategic, logistical calculations. And in fact, for a long time, as we'll have much better, much more detailed, precise coastal geographical maps than the interland, and until essentially the 18th century, air balloons and so on, it would be much more difficult to kind of see literally or calculate the distances of in a more concrete fashion. These maritime republics developed pretty important amount of also amphibious capabilities, disembarking troops via small boats under covering fire, logistics, maintaining supply chains over long distances. This fostered administration, state building, because control must be more unitary, right? Pisa has, differently from Genoa, has an early communal identity revolving properly around the sense of a single leadership, right? Even though the city was a republic, as a matter of fact. In fact, there is one of the best constitutions ever in Pisa during the Middle Ages. Territorial claims propelled Pisan 12th century expansions by providing experienced crews drawn from urban and subject populations. For example, in Sardinia, because the Sardinians had literally at some point called the Pisans, right? First against the Saracens to become, however, unavoidable to end up being lorded by the Pisans in turn. So there were all these incredible feuds in the interline. Imagine Scotland, right, in Mediterranean. Like, that's basically the clanic culture of the Sardinian interland, and the Pisans had to intervene every once in a while, because if, say, there was a war between, due to cattle raiding and this widespread destruction, etc., the same Pisan exports would be damaged in the process. There's a great deal of shipbuilding infrastructure along the Arno as well established, including the Pisan port and other buildings, as we'll see now, that allow to operate further positions on the islands, right? Pisan naval operations in the early 12th century extended beyond the Levant, all right? Remember, the first crusade, as we will see now, had already occurred, obviously enough, and the Pisans had an important role overall. And most of Pisan naval warfare at this point incorporated raids and blockades that tested emerging rivalries with former allies as well. As we were saying, joint Pisan-Genoese fleets had previously dominated Tyrrhenian waters against Saracen bases through combined operations that cleared pirate strongholds, essentially using overwhelming galley force for encirclement and protected trade routes vital for the flow of goods. These are the first polities that can properly field large numbers of galleys, right? They have a virtually permanent navy. No other power can afford that, right? These guys have the various city families operating their galleys in fundamentally autonomous fashion, but it's obvious that when the entire city was at war, these milites, knightly clans that ruled the same consular commune of the city would simply say, okay, well, this is a common cause. Let's put in common literally some galleys for the war. And so they wouldn't even need to recruit, find them somewhere. And this is the great edge that the Italian city-states really have. And the roots of this are, again, for another video, but the facts, as we will see now, speak by themselves. Speaking of this relation, this toxic relationship at the end of the day between Pisa and Genoa, diverging commercial priorities such as competition over exclusive control of island resources like timber and minerals, tariffs on passing shipping, and Levantine markets for spices and textiles soon sparked friction as both republics sought to monopolize lucrative trade lanes linking Europe to the wealth of East. Right? It was effectively the Italians that kept the connections between the Levant and Europe. All right, as we just explained, wasn't really like an autonomous power, say from France or from England. It could simply send ships. This happened. There was, for example, the Norwegian Crusade, etc. That was a bit of a Viking bias of maritime activity, but it was much easier to hire the Italians, and that in any case were there. They actually had been in the Levant even before the Crusades. Think about the relics of St. Mark recovered at some point in the High Middle Ages by the Venetians from Egypt, and Italians would remain even after the fall of the Outremer state, right? But they're the ones that actually supplied, because we've seen with Genoa in the video about the 11th century, they literally dismantled their own galleys to allow for the construction of siege machinery, siege towers for capturing Jerusalem, for which they were greatly recognized. Even at the expenses of the Pisans for fame, there was a fierce competition between them. For example, in 1119, Genoese galleys intercepted Pisan vessels bound for home ports, initiating a pattern of opportunistic ship captures and coastal raids that characterize a low-intensity but persistent war involving hit-and-run tactics such as surprise attacks on beached or lightly escorted ships rather than full-scale fleet battles in open water. Driven by the economic incentives of seizing valuable cargoes of silver, textiles, or spices without the high costs and risks of formal declarations of war. This is quite dangerous because in the 12th century, the Italian communes are not states yet, which means that they don't have yet, not even in Pisa, a more unified policy. Much of the aforementioned clans that run the cities see this still in sort of private aristocratic terms. If some of their captains had intercepted, sort of carried out an act of piracy, as the many that still exist. For example, the Moors had been fundamentally repressed. At this point, the Mediterranean is an Italian lake, but of course, it's not until the 19th century you can blockade, say, stretches of sea. Right? There were always ships you could somehow intercept. It was more difficult to do so, obviously, for the naval technology of the time. In fact, ambushes were mostly attempted, considering all the sort of know-how expertise of the time, like calculating all the whirlwinds of different periods of the year in certain stretches of the Mediterranean to sort of imagine that, say, the next enemy cargo would pass there. Next to an island, you could set up an ambush or something like that at Similia, right? There is also not really, especially in Corsica and Sardinia, that will actually become the main object of, if anything, territorial content between the Genoese and the Pisans. Major settlements that, say, either the Pisans or the Genoese would besiege, right? They were mostly towns. These islands are not particularly developed. If anything, greater problems existed, for example, in the Byzantine or the Crusade or even Islamic markets, right? Because as we'll see now, and this really develops in the 12th century, what the Italians did in a quite toxic way for everybody involved was basically, helping, as we already observed during the Reconquista, to capture certain cities, but wanting, first of all, their share, and this mostly invariably included, telling the truth, because the maritime republics were actually not interested in any interland control. It was too costly. They weren't keen. They didn't care about doing that. The ports, the fortified ports, that would further fortify that. In this sense, they were the only ones capable of controlling, because they were the only ones of having a fleet, and so even powers from the interland could not really besiege a portual citadel that was continuously resupplied by a fleet that could not be destroyed by the land forces, right? And only other Italians can create the same can create the same threat. So it's mostly like the story of, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, this coastal cities destroyed by urban battles between the Latin occupants, right, for their own rivalries back home. And this is especially the case for Pisa and Genoa. But speaking of the aforementioned raid in 1119, Pisan responses involved swift retaliatory strikes along Corsican and Sardinian shores. Because the Genoese were technically already there themselves, right? This pattern of occupation had been fairly mixed. Corsica, as you know, will end up in Genoese hands that had already been partially occupied. Also in the north of Sardinia, there are some Genoese outposts. In any case, there are ships sailing along the east coast and stopping there. So by patrolling the shore, you can intercept it at some point. In fact, where both republics vied for control of timber resources, we explained in particular at this point, as they were growing, so they needed ever more of this resource for galley construction. Imagine just the costs of upkeeping large amounts of galleys. These are staggering costs, right? Regular replacement due to structural wear from constant use in combat, other than just trade. For not talking about the strategic harbors that offer sheltered anchorages against storms and defensive positions with elevated vantage points for early warning, right? If you don't control that, you have to pay a toll, because at least the ships there can be used even in an ambush, but mostly the local garrisons would have not let you beach. Right. It's these encounters that hone further Pisan expertise in rapid fleet maneuvers, such as coordinated spurring to whole enemy vessels. Hopefully, like, say, the idea of ramming and spurring is something that is always variable. There were different ship designs, but mostly it was about destroying their superstructure, boarding their decks with grappling hooks and hand-to-hand combat. Amphibious landings, using small boats to disembark troops quickly on hostile shores under covering arrow fire. This stuff had already been there, just were not as well documented, say, for the Middle Ages, the previous centuries, compared to the 12th in particular. But we have to enter a bit a sort of a different mentality from the idea these guys sprang out again from nowhere. Right, there is no doubt there is a massive upgrade in scale, that indeed the communes are something relatively new, that there is, at least there were already the urban centers capable of defending themselves, etc. But not even in the Saracen era, these communities had been merely passive, right? Just there were other times, but we have, even during the Carolingian era, for example, the Strait of Boniface between Corsica and Sardinia is named after the Carolingian Count of Tuscany that launched expeditions also into as far as Tunisia, right? Punitive raids. The same Byzantine Sicily, before being invaded by the Arabs, actually had a pretty intense raiding activity, and the same North Africa as well. So there is something we have a bit missed, especially in pop culture, and definitely this extraordinary naval culture. Right, military engineering. These Italian fleets really displayed essentially the most advanced maritime technology of the era, and in an unprecedented scale in any case. So they're really something that hadn't been born the other day, right? They're just now quite prepotently expanding. By 1120, Genoese forces reported in contemporary accounts as ranging from 22 to over 80 galleys, even though the latter end is a bit too much, plus support vessels like transports for siege equipment and smaller scout ships approached the Arno mouth, prompting Pisan squadrons to engage in defensive actions that resulted in captures and repulses. This underscored the Republic's capacity for coordinated harbor defense, even amid divided command structures between elected consuls that could, in fact, carry out as in their handling of civil and military affairs, sort of different policies. It was a collegial magistracy, just like the Roman one. The same archbishops that in Pisa are actually very powerful, even occasionally participating to local urban battles. We have news of sort of they have these clans battling one another in the city. You would think the archbishop arrives and does something to pacify. He actually brings a catapult into a private garden and starts bombarding one of the two clans' towers. Right, so that's also what, interestingly enough, happens. But in any case, also providing spiritual and often operational leadership. We're not going to digress here on the concept of militia, right, and the Ghibelline suggestions and the imperial activity that now we will see has a lot to do with trying to use Pisa in particular as the naval arm of the Holy Roman Emperors that otherwise didn't have much reach the Mediterranean. And all these actors definitely competed for authority within the communal system. In the years immediately following, Pisan land forces in Tuscany engaged in a series of border skirmishes and sieges as well that tested the commune's growing military independence from feudal overlords, right? Because this is a phase in which feudal districts still exist. Actually, the peasants are very much preferred, right, co-opted by the same emperor, but there are lots of prior dynasties. For example, the Canossas that have just expired here after having protected Florence, that tended to affirm their own prerogatives over the rising communes that were sort of juridical, if not anomaly, definitely an innovation. Recently made a video about the wars of the First Lombard League that partially explains this also in an imperial optic. Indeed, the communes were recognized by the emperors, but used in different ways. Clashes around the strategic fortress of Ripafratta, situated on elevated terrain controlling access to the Serchio River valley and key overland routes linking Pisa to northern Tuscany, intensified. Pisan infantry and cavalry columns drawn from urban citizens obligated to serve under communal oaths of loyalty organized by neighborhoods, the contrade, or guilds for cohesion, supported by siege trains of catapults, mangonels, in the later period, trebuchet, for hurling large stones to batter walls, and covered ramps protected by sheds on wheels for undermining or breaching fortifications, repeatedly assaulted Lucchese-held positions in the Serchio Valley. One notable 1114 engagement saw Pisan commanders exploit a nocturnal approach under cover of darkness, using stealth to avoid detection by sentries, to scale outer walls undetected with ladders, forcing a Lucchese withdrawal after fierce hand-to-hand combat in the baileys, using swords, spears, shields, and axes, in confined spaces where individual province unit cohesion and discipline proved crushing against numerical comparable foes. In the opening years of the 12th century, Pisan fleets generally operated along the Syrian coast in coordination with Genoese forces as well. They had become the watch sea dogs, so to say, of the Crusader states, contributing to the capture of ports. In fact, it secured supply lines and training outposts for the nascent Outremer principalities established after the First Crusade success in 1099. In fact, when, as we've seen, we're remembering the Genoese contribution to the capture of Jerusalem in particular was really crucial. But while the Italians did participate with substantial land forces, what happened when, say, big cities like Antioch or Jerusalem were seized, and so also cities that had a regional impact, like control on the coastland, the Italian fleets had rushed to seize immediately, given the disruption of local Islamic control of these various fortified ports. Right, that's what they wanted to control, and they anchored themselves there by also thus receiving great trade privileges and autonomous rights by the same local Christian policies to maintain those logistical lanes. The First Crusade, as you know, had seen Western Christian armies responding to Pope Urban II's call, capture Jerusalem from Fatimid control, and establish kingdoms in the Levant, including, as we said, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, the County of Tripoli. Amid ongoing threats from Islamic powers employing mobile cavalry tactics that, however, also reflected this mostly raiding character that could do up to a certain point, as we've seen also in the Battle of Antioch, for example, for our tactical reconstruction series, just so much against the heavier Christian knights, as a matter of fact, were much bulkier and resistance. The assault on Acre in 1104 exemplified this pattern. After a prolonged siege by land, involving mining walls and assaults with ladders and rams, and sea with blockades preventing resupply by Fatimid galleys, because Egypt was also one of those few powers that could temporarily assemble a fleet, all right, but also at great cost, and never, again, Italian ships were the ones that countered this, involving Baldwin I of Jerusalem, brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, who had led the initial conquests, but died in 1100 without direct heirs. Baldwin expanded its territories through pragmatic alliances with Italian naval powers for naval support and supplies, while managing fragile feudal structures of vassal knights amid threats from Fatimid Egypt, which controlled much of the southern Levant with its galley fleet based in ports like Alexandria and Damietta, and cavalry forces, local Islamic emirs also using hit-and-run tactics from inland bases. Acre fell following 20 days of determined fighting. This granted the Pisans and their allies a share of its revenues from port dues and incoming ships and market facilities. The victory at Acre, achieved with crucial Pisan naval blockade support alongside Genoese ships that arrived at nearby Haifa to enforce the sea closure and preventing Egyptian reinforcements, allowed thus Baldwin to promise safe passage to defenders under terms of surrender, while the Italian sailors secured plunder in the form of goods, captives for ransom or labor, and treasures from warehouses. They were to seize those facilities anyway. It strengthened the kingdom's primary port on the Levantine coast, established dedicated peasant commercial quarters there, enclaves with warehouses for storing imported-exported goods, churches for religious service under Latin rite, in legal autonomy under their own consuls for resolving disputes according to peasant customs. So this was some sort of mother community, not quite mother city. These weren't quite empires, like sometimes it's attributed to Venice. We'll look at some point better at the administration of these lands. We talk about it in that video about the 11th to 13th century Venetian navy and army organization a bit, right? For Crete, for other territories that were seized at some point by the Latins in the east. So this all facilitated direct trade in Levantine goods such as spices, pepper, cinnamon, silk from Byzantine or further east, and dyes like Tyrian purple, right? Just at the time of the Phoenicoi, of the Reds, right? Similar operations targeted other coastal strongholds, such as Laodicea, a key Syrian port with access to inland routes, and Solino under Tancred. In fact, these cities in the Middle Ages were mostly known with their Italian attributed names. This happened under Tancred of Hauteville, that, as you know, was a Norman prince and regent of Antioch, renowned for his military prowess in battles against Seljuk Turks, using heavy cavalry charges in the Frankish style narrated from, in fact, the southern Italian conquests, combined with siege techniques like mining and artillery, and later Ptolemaidan. It is the same Acre, as we've seen, with Venetian and Genoese participation. Each conquest yielded rich spoils, immovable wealth, gold, silver, textiles, and strategic advantages that facilitated freer Christian access to the Holy Land by securing pilgrim routes from Italian ports as well, and supply chains for Crusader armies. These were veritable brutal conquests. Like the Crusades arrived, you can argue, from almost a day to another. Pretty destabilized situation. I mean, Jerusalem had just been reconquered by the Fatimids from the Seljuks, right, in the year before the Christian conquest during the First Crusade. So more of that. If you're interested, I made some videos about Syrian warfare, Egyptian warfare. So we are no stranger to these lands. You can't understand how they couldn't simply move away their wealth in the moment the Crusaders arrived from a moment to another. So the storming of these cities would would yield really a lot of riches that the Latins put their hands on. Baldwin demonstrated his appreciation by dividing conquered cities in their income, such as customs revenues from port traffic and land rights for agriculture or taxation, among the contributing republics. If you're interested in how also the Kingdom of Jerusalem worked militarily-wise, especially from an organizational standpoint, I made a video about the Assises de l'Haute Cour. We are admittedly in the later 13th century, in the last decades of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, what was left of it. But it gives you really a pretty good idea of, for example, the money thieves, how these areas were not quite working, like especially Frankish Europe, right? There was a lot of greater centrality of urban economy, right, in the picture. Even though, again, these were not particularly developed areas compared, for example, to the same Italy at this point. Nevertheless, they had, of course, millenary tradition in urban history. Now, Tancred granted Pisan merchants streets and commercial freedoms in Antioch and Laodicea after the reduction of those sites with Pisan assistance in 1106. These privileges included dedicated warehouses for storing goods safely, as I said before, legal protections under their own officials for dispute resolution according to Pisan law, and exemptions from certain tolls to invite them to stay, right, to de facto permanently garrison these ports. This, because otherwise these principalities would not had the means to do so. They simply forfeited a bit what happened also with the conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1204, these coastal possessions to the Italians. This enabled peasant traders to dominate the segments of the spice, silk, and textile routes linking the Levant to European markets via established caravan paths across Anatolia and Syria that, as you know, were essentially the most important, the most straightforward route of the emerging silk, reviving silk route, so-called, combined also with sea paths through the Mediterranean, often in convoy for protection. In my videos about Italian trade during this point, you can see of how actually far these expeditions arrived, right? The Genoese arrived up to Guinea, for example, or the Atlantic route at some point. So we are so it's incredible to the extent of the projection. We'll never fully know, even before the Pax Mongolica, for example, how many Italians had already reached China, for example. Archbishop Dagobert of Pisa, also known as Daimbert or Dagobert, who had accompanied the crusading fleet eastward and participated in the reduction of Laodicea, rose to become Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. Previously a key ecclesiastical leader in Pisa who had supported papal reforms under Gregory VII, efforts, as you know, to assert papal authority over secular rulers in matters like the investiture of bishops, preventing lay control and combat simony, sale of offices, and clerical marriage. Dagobert joined the crusade with Pisan troops, following Pope Urban II's call at the Council of Clermont in 1095. This launched the First Crusade by promising, in fact, spiritual indulgences, remission of sins for participants who took the cross. Bishops were to lead by example in that regard. Elected after the deposition of Arnulf of Schock with backing from Bohemond of Antioch, the leader, that the relative of Tancred, and that I also made an entire video on, right, that we had properly founded the Principality of Antioch through conquests in northern Syria using combined arms, knights and infantry, as we've seen in 1098 at the Battle of Antioch. He received homage from Godfrey and Baldwin. Tensions over lay authority in Jerusalem, where the patriarch sought church supremacy over the king in temporal matters like land control and taxation, led to his temporary removal, however, before Genoese naval arrivals altered the power dynamics by providing Baldwin with alternative naval support. You see there the fierce competition. Dibert died in 1105 or 1107 en route from Rome after seeking papal backing in the matter. His tenure involved complex negotiations with Baldwin, who had been crowned in Bethlehem on Christmas Day 1100 after swearing obedience to the church in a ceremony balancing royal and ecclesiastical power, highlighting the intricate balance of this lay and ecclesiastical authority in the early Crusader states, where kings relied on church legitimacy for rule, while patriarchs needed military protection from feudal lords and external foes alike. The patriarch's influence relied heavily on Pisan naval support, needless to say, until this Genoese arrivals shifted the balance by offering competing alliances. Upon Dibert's death in Messina, that was in fact yet another port for the Levant, en route to Rome in his case, in 1107, while returning in fact from the Urbs, Pietro Morricone succeeded Dibert as archbishop in Pisa, continuing the see's active role in both spiritual and martial affairs through leadership that blended religious authority with oversight of naval expeditions. As we explained before, these were pretty warlike bishops at the same time. Morricone consecrated churches such as St. Peter in Vinculis in Rome, acquired lands and castles for the archdiocese of Pisa to expand its territorial base and economic resources, holding office until around 1119 or 1120, and strengthened its economic basis through rural estates that generated agricultural revenues from grain and olives, fortified positions for defense against raids, and endowments that supported both religious institutions like monasteries for prayer and scholarship, and military readiness amid regional instability from rival cities like Lucca, and external threats, as we've seen in the Mediterranean, from Saracen or Genoese forces. Archiepiscopal leadership in Pisa continued to fuse spiritual authority, such as granting indulgences for participants in holy wars, because of course Pisa, as we've seen, were pretty involved in the Crusades, and leading prayers before battles, with martial oversight of fleets and hosts, often with the archbishop serving as captain general himself. This period coincided with intensified border clashes in Tuscany. The communes were sort of increasing their power both at sea and on land. Pisan and Lucchese forces contested strong points like Ripafrata, as we've seen before. These were pretty close neighbors, as a matter of fact, few tens of kilometers from each other. Pisan victories in the later phases of the 1104 initiated war recovered contested heights through determined assaults involving combined infantry armed with spears and shields and siege elements with catapults and rams, demonstrating improved coordination between these urban troops, citizen soldiers, organized as we've seen in by neighborhood or guilds for mutual support, ever better equipped, also considering the material wealth coming from their success in the Levant, and allied contingents from subject territories, with lots of other smaller communes, and also knights coming from even more far away. Emperor Henry V's mediation around 1110-1111, enforced by his accompanying imperial troops as part of broader Holy Roman imperial politics in Italy, involving interventions in the investiture controversy. Also made a video about the Council of Sutri, as a matter of fact, that involved him in control over northern Italian cities, temporarily quelled hostilities. Henry didn't need war in Tuscany, as he had to cross back and forth, and also required Pisa to provide some adequate naval support. Lucca did not have a naval power. Underlying tensions over trade routes, land control, and autonomy persisted. These Pisan military successes in the district, the surrounding countryside under communal influence, including rural lands for agriculture and defense, bolster claims to independent consular authority, where elected consuls manage internal governance, justice, and external relations. again, Pisa is different from, say, Amalfi or Genoa that just has to have the mountains behind them. They just have the sea and the mountains. Venice is on a lagoon. Pisa's countryside instead is open in the east, the rest of Tuscany. So there is a lot of friction, especially with Florence. I've explained it before. As we've seen, in fact, in the 11th and 12th century episodes in Florentine history, Matilda of Canosa's weakening marquional power, she was the Marquess of Tuscany, and she had an enormous amount of territory up to northern Italy, up to the Alps. As a powerful imperial ally, at least initially, and a supporter of church reforms during the investiture controversy later, member of the influential Canossa dynasty, also called the Great Countess, we had famously hosted the 1077 meeting at Canossa between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII to resolve a major war over church appointments through public penance, allowed cities greater leeway in local defense pacts. She couldn't do otherwise. She had some grip on Florence, and actually the Florentines wait for her death before creating the commune, because it would have been too sort of anti-feudal for her to hear. But Pisa was already the major threat, backed by the emperor exactly when she was back in the papacy. You have, however, for example, other communes gaining autonomy, such as in the 1112 treaty with Volterra, that formalized mutual aid against common enemies. Matilda extended, however, generous donations to Pisan institutions too, including lands near Petroli to Foscolo Scarpetta of the Griffi family for loyal and defense contributions, because the marquional power was technically all over Tuscany, so these were formal subjects of her. Gifts to the cathedral and canons for religious support, properties to the monks of San Gorgone, and the church of San Vito under her special protection. She provided, these were all assets that in any case the Pisan commune would end up controlling, right? Because they endowed with these ecclesiastical foundations. She provided, in fact, multiple lavish donations in 1083, 1100, 1103, specifically aiding the ongoing construction of the cathedral complex that had begun earlier in Pisa with spoils from prior victories, which symbolized civic pride, economic vitality from trade, and religious devotion. At home, defensive improvements responded to both external threats and internal rivalries. I also made a video about the Italian circle, so these massive fortifications, like the equivalent of encapsulation all over Europe, right? If you look at the fortified rings of the major Italian cities, were the great European metropolises, you realize it's something utterly insane. It's also not publicized, like it's the age of castles, yes, but what about this giants? Needless to say, also there were lots of castles in these districts as well, right? But Pisa is fortified. In this period, we had the construction of the sea gate, Porta al-ʿāmirī, known then as Legazia. This was a fortified gate and arsenal area near the sea that was much closer at the time than it is today for shipbuilding and repair, marked an initial step towards systematic fortification around 1102 to protect the harbor from raids. The Verruca fortress, erected on a commanding peak in the Pisan Mountains about 6 miles from the city, providing early warning through visual signals, smoke or flags, and oversight for surrounding plains, the Arno, Nievole, Chiana valleys, and distant vistas toward Genoa and Provence for strategic intelligence on approaching forces. Provence was yet another place infested by the Italians that often witnessed clashes between the Pisans and the Genoese. A destructive fire in the Kinsica quarter in 1102, fanned by strong winds common in the coastal region, the Libeccia or Mistral, underscored vulnerabilities even as these improvements proceeded, destroying homes and highlighting the need for better urban planning with stone construction and fire breaks. The completion of the Primaziale, the cathedral, part of the famous Piazza dei Miracoli complex around 1103, stood as a monument to Pisan artistic and cultural vitality, featuring innovative architecture blending Roman columns and arches, Byzantine mosaics and domes, and Islamic decorative motifs from trade contexts, as influences, as evoked. There was a very distinctive and native Pisan style. It was incredibly beautiful, frankly. It was actually much more advanced than all of this. When you look at the Byzantine art in Italy, is much more advanced. The Byzantine art in Constantinople. When you look at Islamic Sicily, and you realize it was actually Norman Sicily, and that the locals there were not even necessarily Islamic for making those Islamic motifs. They're more beautiful than ones carried out in the Muslim countries, right? You have a lot of classical influence there. You have this splendid white, right? There is the Carrara marble quarries not that far away. So we all are aware, so inserted pictures here of the marbles of Pisan churches architecture. These were all funded by spoils from victories and trade wealth. Land wars with Lucca flared repeatedly from the aforementioned 1104 onward, producing alternating victories and defeats. Pisan troops captured Lucca's castellans in one engagement, yet Lucca's forces inflicted defeats on Pisa twice in 1105. There is the season where, there's in Mediterranean longer, by the way, than, say, in Northern Europe. And with this rich and heavily populated districts, there are quite interesting resource to plunder, right? You have their Lucchese ambushes in familiar terrain with superior local knowledge of paths at times, trying to thwart Pisan expansionism. And these struggles reflected the growing autonomy of the Pisan commune in the international scene, which increasingly, in fact, governed itself without counts as Matilda's authority, yielding to urban realities of self-defense and economic self-interest. All right. After Matilda's death, basically that marginal power that had held Tuscany from the post-Carolingian era is evaporating. And even though there are all feudal houses that are also increasingly urbanized, at some point the communes are literally on their own and against each other. Henry V's mediation around 1110 or 1111 helped reconcile the parties after Pisan victories, including the recovery of the contested castle of Ripafratta. A treaty concluded in 1112 with Volterra under Matilda's sovereignty and negotiated by representatives including Count Ugo for Volterra and Ranieri di Simone Rossomini for Pisa, strengthened regional ties through mutual defense clauses against external threats. In 1113, renunciations by the Countess Cecilia and Ugo Visconti before multiple bishops clarified ecclesiastical properties to reduce disputes over tithes and lands. These agreements helped essentially stabilize borders in the Tuscan hinterland, with these ecclesiastical claims as well that had been historically contested in the area, given that the communes now were out there on their own. They were the ones that were to guarantee this order by defining jurisdictions and rights. Pisan land forces maintained pressure in Tuscany anyway through the mid-1120s, launching the 1125-1126 border campaign against Lucca, with coordinated raids in the Nievole and Cerchio valleys that targeted supply lines and minor strongholds via river crossings using boats or fords, and rapid infantry advances using light troops for mobility in hilly terrain. Pisan involvement in the eastern Mediterranean deepened throughout this period through privileges granted by Crusader leaders and Byzantine emperors alike. Treaties, in fact, with Alexius I Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor who ruled from 1081 to 1118, navigating threats from Normans in southern Italy who had conquered territories there under Robert Guiscard, Pecheneг nomads invading from the steppes, and Seljuk Turks who had seized much of Anatolia after massacred in 1071, while restoring some imperial stability through skilled diplomacy, military reforms like the Tagmata professional units, and economic recovery measures such as tax reforms and the Commercian trade duties, ratified a treaty in 1111 after a solemn embassy, including Guido the cleric, Bonfilio the priest, Gerardo Visconti, Ildebrando son of Ranieri, Alferio the consul, Pietro the judge, Guido son of Bono Pipino, and Odimondo Curopalata son of Otto. Right, these were the Pisan representatives with the emperor, and this treaty essentially conferred extensive commercial rights and protections, including reduced customs, duties on goods. Right. Naturally, much of this movement was orchestrated against Venice, that was becoming ever more aggressive. Right after the Cruise of Bull, especially a few decades before, the Byzantines had realized that, if anything, the influence of a single Italian republic had to be mitigated. And so the Pisans at this point are just stronger than the Genoese. As you know, the Genoese come a bit later in. They were already there, telling the truth, but as a major force in the Byzantine Empire, mostly after the Fourth Crusade. In Constantinople, thus a dedicated quarter in the eastern part of the city housed a church of St. Peter, San Pietro properly in Italian, and supported a community that may have reached 1,000 souls at its height, with Pisa enjoying favored nation status for several decades through reduced tariffs and protected warehouses that facilitated the aforementioned trade in silks, spices, and other luxuries directly on the main Byzantine market, because was enormous with Constantinople. Parallel concessions from Baldwin and later rulers in Jerusalem consolidated Pisan holdings in Acre, Jaffa, Caesarea, and other sites with similar quarters and exemptions. Tancred's grants after the Antioch and Laodicea operations, as we've seen further, had further expanded Pisan establishments by providing legal and economic footholds. The most ambitious Pisan undertaking, however, in this early phase of the century was the 1113-1115 expedition against the Balearic Islands. Right, we also know fairly a lot about this. This expedition was framed as a crusade, as it had already been the case against Sardinia, right, to eradicate proper piracy, and so Islamic presence as a whole, and liberate an estimated 20,000 Christian captives held by King Nazaradeo in the Italian chroniclers. In fact, similar variants like Mubashir Nasir ad-Dawla of Majorca. This is a major pirate nest. I made a video about the capture of Majorca essentially 1 century later in the episode about Aragonese warfare, the Crown of Aragon's warfare in the 13th century. But you had already had this important expeditions prior, launched on papal urging and with blessing of Pascal II, who granted the standard of the Roman Church as a symbol of holy war legitimacy. Full indulgences for participants equivalent to those for the Holy Land, remitting sins for fighters, actually were literally the same thing, and appointed Cardinal Bosone as legate to provide ecclesiastical oversight. The fleet, numbering around sort of a pretty consistent expedition, vessels of various types, I'm saying the hundreds, if you consider cargoes, smaller ships at a point as a whole, it may have even been the case. Naturally, fighting galleys were less, but you would have like this more specialized vessel, combat with oarsmen and marines, transport for troops and horses as well, supply ships, departed Pisa on the feast of St. Sistus under Archbishop Peter Moricone, said before, as Captain General, embodying the fusion of religious and military leadership. This campaign, often called the Balearic Crusade, stemmed from an 1113 treaty with Ramon Berenguer III of Barcelona, the count who expanded Catalan influence through strategic marriages, alliances with Occitan lords, and military campaigns against Islamic taifas in Iberia, and involved, in fact, coordinated efforts against the latter, right, the Islamic taifa ruling the Balearic Islands, which served as a major pirate base threatening Mediterranean shipping lanes by launching raids on Christian coasts and vessels from Spain to Greece even. We're telling you how trafficked the Mediterranean was. Pisa drew allies from Catalonia, Occitania, and other Italian regions, creating a broad coalition. A college of 12 ambassadors and future captains was chosen. Azzo Marignani, the consul, Gerardo of the Gherardesca, Gerardo Visconti. These are not Visconti of Milan, they were sort of different Visconti. Aldo Brando of Rinaldo Orlando, Arrigo Enrici, Arrigo Masca, Lottario Guzmani, Duodone Duodi, Ridolfo Parlascio, Lamberto Ricucchi, Pietro Gualandi, and Robertino Francardi, representing key, in fact, noble and consular families for command cohesion. These were all essentially military clans. They were the ones that of which the consular establishment consisted, and therefore they had their knights and lighter horsemen and footmen, crossbows and catapults and so on. So all bringing together this force together with, as we've seen, allies from the whole northern shores on the western Mediterranean and beyond, by the way, because this was a crusade, so you would have people coming really from everywhere in minor numbers. Adverse weather forced a stop at Vada, exposing the city to a Lucchese incursion that was countered by Florentine auxiliaries dispatched at Pisan request. Right. The Florentine captain encamped 2 miles outside the Pisan walls and enforced strict discipline to maintain order. Reinforced by Catalan and Occitan contingents under the same Ramon Berenguer III of Barcelona, William of Montpellier, with 20 ships and 100 knights providing heavy cavalry support for land battles, Améric of Narbonne with 20 more vessels, and the Count of Empúries with 7 vessels laden with arms and supplies, this armada first raided Ibiza. Exploratory vessels scouted enemy dispositions for intelligence on fortifications and troop numbers, while the main force endured storms off Barcelona, repairing damaged ships in that major harbors. 70 of these ships suffered severely from wave damage and leaks that required caulking and timber replacements. And wintering there, in fact, before resuming to allow recovery and resupply from local allies. Initial landings on what proved to be the Catalan coast caused unintended disruption before diplomatic overtures by Aldobrando Orlandi securing local support through negotiations. At Ivica, that is the aforementioned Ibiza, defended by Albunazar from a mountain-flanked city with multiple wall circuits and high towers designed for defense in depth, allowing fallback positions, peasants under captains such as Bartolotto, Eufonso, Epitone, Pietro, and Guido da Parlascio, we know these names from the chronicles, distinguished themselves in naval and land actions involving scaling ladders for wall assaults and close combat with swords and spears. A massive wooden castle, siege tower on wheels, mounting a battering ram toppled the tower, allowing Ugo Visconti and Duodo Duodi to lead the breach, with troops pouring through. Successive assaults overcame additional defenses after 7 days at the second wall and further fighting at the third, culminating in the city's fall amid heavy casualties on both sides from arrows, stones from defenses, and melee combat. Operations then shifted to Majorca, where the fleet disembarked on the Feast of St. Bartholomew, some 3 miles from the city, to avoid immediate defenses. Archbishop Peter delivered exhortations invoking the oppression of Christians held in captivity and the need for heroic sacrifice, reminding troops of fallen comrades at Ivica to boost morale, while the legate added words of consolation and heavenly witness promising spiritual rewards for the fallen. Saracen forces sortied in strength, leading to fierce battles in which peasant captains such as Ugo Belloni Duodo Duodi, Ricucco Orlandi, Ranieri Tigrini, Gerardo Gaetani, Albertino Bellomi, Guido Buti, Gualando and Alberto Gualandi, Ugo Guzmani, Guido Rossi, Viviano Batilan, Franco Albizione, and commoner Popino distinguished themselves through personal valor. Popino, wounded by an arrow, continued fighting until felled atop a heap of enemies, exemplifying the mix of elite noble leadership and popular participation from citizen forces. Multiple walled sectors are about Talgidith with 50 towers built by the Islamic ruler Nazaradeo himself for reinforced defense, Bab el-Gidith and El Modemia protected by the Essequino River, as it's described again in Italian, transliterated in the Italian chronicles, and 5 bridges required coordinated assaults with mobile wooden castles on wheels, surpassing wall height for bridging gaps and providing elevated archery platforms, rams for breaching gates, ballista for projectile fire, and every inventable engine adapted from classical, Vitruvian, and contemporary siegecraft. Despite setbacks, including a nocturnal Moorish raid that burned one siege tower with fire attacks using naphtha or similar incendiaries, a devastating disease outbreak from hardships, poor water quality, and overcrowding camps, and the temporary arrival of Butale's forces that captured several Pisan vessels, including one defended by Bernardo Marignano in desperate resistance, Pisan resolve held through discipline and leadership. Ranieri Malcontento earned renown by single-handedly confronting mocking Saracens from the walls before falling atop slain foes in a display of defiance. After the death of Nazaradeo, these are, again, Islamic leaders, Butale succeeded and initially enjoyed some success, wounding Ramon Berenguer in combat. Breaches were forced on the feast of Saint Dorothea through the efforts of Ugo Visconti and Francardo, while Altheo scaled a strong tower, slew its castellan, and raised his banner as a signal of victory. The royal citadel, strongest by nature with elevated position and art through fortifications, thick walls and towers, fell on April the 3rd, 1115, after 27 months of campaigning overall, right? Yielding vast treasures in gold, silver, and goods. Prisoners, including King Burab and the Queen, later baptized in Pisa, along with her son, received a canonry in the cathedral as a symbol of integration and conversion, and a temporary suppression of a major pirate base that had long threatened regional trade. Right? Very interesting crusade, by the way. And you understand, they could have been wiped out from a moment to another with those Saracen land and sea counterattacks, right? But here there is a massive investment and determination that keeps this coalition together. And the Pisans, as we've seen here, exhibit great displays of prowess. Guido Pisano gained lasting fame in these final actions through leadership and bravery as well. The victory, chronicled in the contemporary Liber Maiolicinus epic poem composed in Latin hexameters to celebrate Pisan heroism and divine favor, detailing phases from preparation to conquest with emphasis on Christian zeal and civic pride, resulted in Pisan control of the Balearics until around 1184, when Almoravids or others reasserted dominance. This is also a relatively missing aspect, like the Pisan dominance of the Balearic Islands. The victory provided significant spoils, such as the famous Pisa Griffin bronze artifact, likely looted from Islamic workshops. I inserted here among the pictures. This is a symbol of prestige, in fact displayed in the same cathedral of Pisa, bolstering the Republic's prestige as a crusading power. Fallen Pisans received honorable burial at Marseille's Saint Victor before the fleet's return as a gesture of alliance with Provençal supporters. The victory also prompted diplomatic gestures, such as the gift of porphyry columns to Florence in gratitude for its earlier aid against Lucca and the founding of the Church of St. Andrew in Kinsica, with monks from St. Victor to pray for the souls of the dead in perpetual commemoration. Following the Balearic triumph, Pisan forces leveraged their enhanced siege capabilities in support of broader coalitions. Artisans from Pisa and Genoa were sought by Milanese forces in 1127 to construct advanced wooden castles, interestingly enough. Disassemblage siege towers, in particular for sieges, large ballista for artillery fire, and naval siege engines for operations against Como, illustrating the Republic's reputation for engineering prowess in mobile towers that could be disassembled for transport over land, and projectile systems that surpass contemporary norms in range and accuracy through improvised torsion or counterweight mechanisms. With all those lakes there, all those various branches, you have the need. Also, at some point, even the Garda Lake on the a few 100 kilometers away, you'd have Galles per Montes, right, in a famous episode in late medieval warfare. So there's actually a pretty underrated aspect in 12th century Italian and general European military engineering, with including seated chariots, right? Aside from the carroccia, but some wagon forts that people say, look at the Hussites in the 15th century. They existed since millennia, and actually they were used also in other contexts, right? They are not as publicized for different reasons. Pisan contingents also reinforced Tuscan alliances, notably aiding Florentine operations in the Arno Valley, where combined forces employed riverine blockades using ships to control waterways for supply denial and mounted raids to secure contested valleys against imperial-aligned holdouts. Pisan participation in southern Italian campaigns is also quite relevant throughout this period. During the 1130s, you have this interesting showcasing of Pisan combined armed tactics as fleets supported land contingents in actions around Amalfi and Salerno. We've seen this also in the video about Roger II of Hauteville, all right, explaining what was happening in the southern Italian mainland with those rebels that were resisting the Sicilian monarchy recompaction, all right. And just as we've seen in the Outremer states, the northern maritime republics support, like they installed themselves really into the Kingdom of Sicily's ports, right, in exchange for their military aid. This is when it starts beginning, however, as an offensive campaign launched with imperial papal support against the Kingdom of Sicily. Surprise assaults exploited normal, at least local vulnerabilities in coastal defenses, such as incomplete fortifications, and yielded not only plunder but also strategic legal codices, among other things. The history of, as we were saying before, medieval literature and philology does pass through this, right? The Pandex of Justinian, foundational Roman law texts, were recovered from the Amalfitane archives, because, as you know, these were originally Byzantine duchies that had always been sort of quite decentralized from Constantinople, but they had preserved in their archives sort of pretty interesting manuscripts regarding that Byzantine past that enriched Pisan intellectual resources. Were already quite advanced, right, in Roman law, juridical science in general, philology, technology. So we've seen that the Pisans were really at the forefront in many ways. For developing now maritime law codes, for example, governing trade contracts and naval matters, as business required a much more complex juridical theory and practice that here even the Bolognese school was pioneering with that interest properly from practical application. The Amalfi campaign of 1135-1136, I also have a medieval Amalfi if you're interested. It was canonically the first Italian maritime republic that, however, declined earlier as well, stood as a pinnacle of Pisan offensive reach, responding to papal calls against Roger II of Sicily, who was consolidating Norman power into a concentrated kingdom. A fleet under consular command executed a swift descent on the harbor, destroying moored ships with incendiary projectiles, such as firepots or Greek fire variants delivered via tubes or catapulted before landing troops that stormed the lower town. Subsequent assaults on inland castles routed relieving Norman forces from Aversa, allowing systematic sack and the acquisition of archives. This was the end for the Amalfitane maritime autonomy, politically, strategically. This was followed by operations against Salerno, historically other Lombard, this time Lombard duchy, on the sea, right? Were coordinated land-sea pressure blockades to starve the city, combined with land investment in using siege works, compelling submission and further enrich the Republic's coffers and prestige, cementing its dominance in southern Tyrrhenian while tying it more closely to anti-Norman coalitions as well. In the same decade, in fact, Peasant galleys and infantry provided naval escort and landing support for Innocent II's campaigns in central Italy against Anacletus II's supporters during a papal schism, including blockades near coastal strongholds in Latium that helped secure papal supply routes by preventing enemy supply by sea. Thereafter, warfare increasingly centered on rivalry with Genoa over Corsica, Sardinia, and Tyrrhenian commercial dominance. Right? There is a phase of stabilization of the trade routes, so still warfare alongside those, mainly at sea. But the Western islands were something more relevant for strategic deployment. We've seen the background to this rivalry, right? We have seen the 1119, 1120 campaigns where the Genoese attack the Arno mouth and the peasants managed to fence off this attack, right? There are differences in analytic accounts regarding this, but in any case, the peasants maintain, of course, control of their ports. Papal interventions under Calixtus II and Innocent II produced a temporary partition of Corsican bishoprics. Right? Genoa receiving Mariana, Nebbio, and Accia in the north, while Pisa retained Aleria, Ajaccio, Sagona, and primacy over Sardinia, more importantly, with its richer resources. Corsica was poor, objectively, while confirming other privileges to balance power. So this is interesting because, you see, Corsica at some point had been part of the Italic kingdom. Still at this point, like the idea is that fundamentally by whom is it controlled? By these Italians as well. And there are local communities. There is an ecclesiastical administration. At this point, the papacy has been established, even some in North Africa, when the Normans had launched expeditions there. So this is a matter of territorial control passing through political establishment and international recognition. This was a bit of a far west by Italian standards, and mostly the conflict for dominance continued between Genoa and Pisa accordingly. Archbishops such as Azzo, formerly Archdeacon of Piacenza and later Cardinal, bringing administrative experience from imperial and papal circles, and Ruggeri, previously Bishop of Volterra with local knowledge of Tuscan affairs, enriched the Pisan See through documented acquisitions of lands and rights that expanded ecclesiastical wealth for funding expeditions. Right? Bishops participated with their own troops to the communal expeditions as well. I partially described this in some videos about the Italian communal army organization, but episcopal power is often underplayed. Communes normally acted on behalf of the bishop. There was a bishop count since Ottonian times, and that was more an excuse through which communes also marginalized bishops probably in a political military direction. But in Pisa, as we see here, bishops are actually pretty powerful, and they wage war. They're really considered as high spiritual figures, also in military affairs. An 1125 defensive pact with Volterra obliged mutual aid at own expense to counter common threats. Volterra is the very center of Tuscany. In this sense, it's reachable by the extremes. It's under pressure of the Florentines, so the peasants create some ties with it. Also because the Volterrans know that there is no chance that the peasants are simply going to expand in Tuscan hinterland with all what they have ongoing abroad, right? But Florence, that is a completely terrestrial power, is sort of quite looming over these smaller communes. Genoese raids in the 1120s targeted Corsica, Sardinia, and the Elba Island in Piombino. That was yet another sort of smaller possession, but as you know, since antiquity and Etruscan times, rich in mineral resources to extract. Burning ships and taking prisoners for ransom or labor. Pisan countermeasures and papal mediation led to further truces, including one in 1133. that provided temporary respite. We've seen the Pisans in these decades side with the empire and the papacy against Roger II of Sicily. They raid Amalfi, also the adjacent Scala and Ravello on the Amalfi coast. All these expeditions secured short-term gains in wealth and prestige while deepening ties also with the Hohenstaufen cause that was emerging in Germany from the 1140s, the 1150s, right, with Conrad. I made a video about Conrad's Italic reign, right? Then later we'll see now what happens with Barbarossa as well. And all this initially has to do with an anti-Norman alignment, right? Because the swarming, as we'll see now in the Kingdom of Sicily, is yet to fully happen. It's going to happen, in fact, with the arrival of the Hohenstaufen as well. At some point, the secular Normans tried to remain relatively autonomous, or using, for example, the Genoese, because it's not immediately there, or at least it is only when there is an attack on the Normans that are here at odds with the Papacy and the Empire, the Byzantines at the same time. And so if, say, the Emperor wants to use naval pressure, the Pope wants to do, we'll ask mostly the Pisans. There are also the stronger maritime republic in the west, because there's Venice that is stronger, but he's playing another game to intervene, right? Naturally, in spite of the wealth and power of Pisa, all these pressures, including the internal Tuscan ones, require careful allocation of limited manpower between overseas commitments and home defense against Luke and others. I mean, not that the city was small, it was not densely populated, but obviously all these military commitments had a cost as well. So you didn't have to excessively strain their manpower commitment. Pope Eugenius III, a native Pisan of the Paganelli family born near Montemagno by the Verruca, reinforced privileges during his visits as pontiff and worked to reconcile Pisa with Lucca amid ongoing Tuscan disorders through diplomatic mediation. The 1140s and 1150s witnessed renewed Tuscan coalition warfare where Pisan commanders refined combined armed tactics in the countryside. In one 1144 campaign near Morona, Pisan heavy infantry under Gaetani and Orlandi captains formed disciplined ranks with pretty thickly packed infantry that absorbed Lucchese charges before counterattacking with crossbow volleys. Right, naturally it was cavalry from both sides, but the idea being that maritime republics had some tougher infantries, or at least especially increasing missile power. This was a bit the case for the Genoese, the Pisans. This is not entirely true. It's a bit legendary, meaning that it was really impressive, but it was not sort of a prerogative of these republics, apparently. It was very difficult to properly measure, right? And in any case, it's evident that especially from naval warfare to terrestrial one, at least in some circumstances, the adoption of the crossbows as a powerful ranged weapon capable of piercing armor of distance was increasingly there. Like in Italian warfare, cavalry was also a pretty shocking force, using lances that competed with the ones of infantry in a pretty gruesome battle, turning, in this case, in 1144, a stalemate into a crushing rout with hundreds of prisoners of Lucca marched back for ransom, and so providing funds or labor on fortifications as well. Tuscan rivalries escalated into multi-party coalitions involving also Florence and Siena. Right, we've seen here the 1144 break of the Morona siege, right, by the Lucchese, under Pisan troops commanded by, among others, Gerardo and Lorenzo Gaetani alongside Guglielmo Orlandi. This Pisan victory drew in Florentine and Sienese participation on opposing sides, with Pisan-Florentine forces conducting raids that burned Sienese border territories and ambushed enemy foraging parties to disrupt logistics. food and fodder supplies, while retaliatory Lucchese incursions targeted Pisan countryside holdings. Now you have this moment, these alignments where the Pisans and the Florentines are together, oddly enough, right? They didn't like each other at all, but in this circumstance, the Tuscan alliances were very fluid. Again, communes were expanding, and there wasn't a single hegemonic one like in the later centuries. If anything, these operations also highlighted Pisa's ability to mobilize rapid relief force via river and road networks and integrate all these sort of allied contingents through shared command structures. During the 1140s, Pisan squadrons also launched hit-and-run attacks on Genoese-held ports and timber yards in eastern Corsica to assert influence over those disputed bishoprics that we talk about before, and resources like shipbuilding materials once again. From the middle of the 12th century, Pisan military activity shifted towards sustained defense of existing gains and consolidation of territorial and commercial positions amid intensifying rivalry with Genoa, that was continuing to grow, by the way, and recurrent Tuscan border wars, right? You see, in the first part of the 12th century, Pisa literally boomed, right? They settled on the Levantine coastline under the protection of Crusader state. They managed to storm the Balearic Islands to partially control them. And so there are some, they control Sardinia, parts of Corsica. So there is so much here to supervise. Like, they have to slow down a bit, in expansionistically speaking, and try to maintain what they have, because the costs are increasing, and also the pressure put on their foes. In the mid-1150s, under the long consulship of Cocco Griffi, who exercised authority for 17 consecutive years, thanks to his exceptional qualities of leadership in diplomacy to secure alliances, military acumen in coordinating forces, and ability to stabilize internal politics amid factionalism that in any case it's always present, Pisa undertook major defensive works to fortify against raids, right? Indeed, if this whole dominion depended on one city, right, you wanted it to be very well protected. In fact, aside from the fact that the city is expanding, suburbs and all the people that work for the major guilds are without protection outside the walls. So the new urban walls replaced the obsolete earlier circuits, extending from the aforementioned Portovenere, which housed the arsenal fortresses we've seen for ship construction, repaying with slips for galleys, westward to the Camposanto with 6 gates. Portovenere itself for sea access. Porta dei Lecci later walled, and opposite Via Garraia di San Vito, 2 others of unknown name that were also walled for security. Porta Buozza, named after the noble Buozzi family, and Porta del Leone, surmounted by the marble lion, now visible inside the walls on the corner between the baptistry and Camposanto as a symbol of strength and vigilance. The circuit continued to Via Calcesana with 7 additional gates, including one of unknown name midway along the Camposanto, Porta di Santo Stefano opposite the Archiepiscopal Palace, Porta di Parlascia corresponding to Via Sant'Anna, another walled gate of unknown name, Porta Monetaria near the suppressed church of San Zeno, also called because coins were minted outside it, linking defense to economic functions of the mint, obviously, Porta della Pace opposite to Via San Lorenzo, and Porta Calcesana at the head of its namesake street. All right, so obviously all these circoli do not quite exist anymore, but you have in the urban fabric, so to say, still the toponomastic trace of them, right? I made an entire video about these this circle, this fortified circuits, if you're interested in all the matter, like looking at so many of these fortifications at once that remain, aside from, in fact, the Renaissance, the disruption for establishing, in fact, more updated modern fortifications. That there is a rich archaeology as well, right? Further sections of this infrastructure reach the Ponte alla Spina, now Ponte alle Piagge or alla Fortezza, with 2 gates, the fortified bridge. Porta alle Piagge near the Arno Bank, also called St. Barnaba, and Porta della Spina. These are very beautiful places, by the way. If you have an idea of Pisa's landmarks, etc., there are still sort of marvelous buildings dating, especially from the 13th to 14th century, that are the peak, of course, of city's power. The southern enclosure added 5 gates, among them St. Mark, later enclosed in the new fortress after the opening of the modern Florentine gate, so-called, one of the unknown name between St. Martin and the Carmen, St. Egidius's or Roman Gate, St. Anthony's Gate, and the Legazia that we mentioned before, that is Porta Mar once again. Additional public works include excavation of various drainage ditches in the low-lying plains to prevent flooding, given the Arno's major potency that could, in fact, weaken the very foundations of the city. If you have an idea of the Pisa Tower width of the baptistry, like inclined, it's in part also because obviously all this terrain is this ground is properly formed by an alluvial plain that doesn't have much of a basis in any case to sustain all that weight. Besides, this humidity could spread disease or hinder movement, right? This infrastructure extends logically also to the broader district. For example, there is the construction of the fountain of St. Stephen near what will become Livorno in Medicean era for the convenience of navigators resupplying water for long voyages, and therefore also incentivizing coastal navigation along the Pisan district. There is the reinforcement of Porto Pisan, the Pisan port, with 2 additional towers for harbor defense against blockades. This is also represented in later works. I inserted the pictures here. You have the erection of a tower on the Meloria rock as an offshore warning and defensive position for controlling sea approaches. In fact, in 1284, as you know, there would be a major naval battle there that ideally marks the decline of Pisan, especially sea power, even though Pisa went on as a major force and also with overseas possessions in Sardinia up to especially the early 14th century as one of the most robust powers of the era. And strengthening of the frontier fortress at Ripafratta as an effective bulwark against Lucca, again, because the frontier there didn't move very much, like Pisa did not have means to simply besiege and seize Lucca, right? But there you have improved walls, garrisons, and provisioning, all right, for better defense in general. Under Cocogriphi's direction, new arsenals near the citadel were also built, capable of housing 70 galleys, later supplemented by 2 smaller covered slips for protection from elements. The complex provided storage for timber, iron fittings, ropes, sails, and all necessary materials, with housing erected for the workforce of shipwrights, carpenters specializing in hulls and masts, caulkers, and laborers to support continuous production and rapid repairs. We have pretty interesting documents showing how much a war galley needed to be properly fitted, repaired, right, armed. We have the list of all these specialized crafts, and we can imagine how thriving, right, the Pisan guilds and workshops were at this point in time. Again, they were also pioneering military technology in a very consistent fashion. And progress in Pisa continued on the magnificent baptistery, right? It mostly as the tower is, as we'll see now, the tower will be started in the 1170s, then they stopped and they finished it in the late 13th. And in any case, you have this complex that was already there, the space is already there. The baptistery is continuously built at this point under the direction of 2 Pisan overseers, Cinetto Cinetti and Arrigo Cancellieri, funded by a universal family contribution of 1 gold solidus, equivalent to a florin in the value at the time, all right, paid by 34,000 households, reflecting broad civic participation in monumental architecture that expressed communal wealth and piety. This is immense. Like, solidus was a non-irrelevant amount, and if you consider here how thickly populated the Pisan countryside is, you realize how much pounds arrived to build, in fact, this massive building for medieval standards, something incredible and as much as beautiful. Now, times were also changing in different ways. For example, imperial alignment shaped strategic priorities in general. Diplomas from Frederick I Barbarossa in 1162 and in 1165 formally recognized Pisan jurisdiction over the contado for local governance and taxation, freedom of trade throughout imperial territories to expand markets without barriers, control of the Tyrrhenian Lido from Civitavecchia to Portovenere for coastal dominance and toll collection, and valuable shares in key Sicilian and Campanian ports, including half of Palermo, Messina, Salerno, and Naples, along with Gaeta, Mazara, and Trapani for commercial enclaves with warehouses and legal rights. All right, this was even before the Hohenstaufen seized southern Italy. At this point, if anything, the empire needed, as we said before, further naval projection. And Pisa was by far the best outlet on the Mediterranean that Barbarossa had. And so the emperor massively reinforces Pisan dominion by confirming sort of powers that the Pisans had already been gradually acquiring, de facto, including the infiltration in southern Italian ports, right, with the aforementioned mechanism, but still conferring to the Pisan community like an unprecedented level of international recognition. These grants from the Emperor Frederick I were later reconfirmed by his son Henry VI, as well as Otto IV and Frederick II throughout the 13th century as well, to maintain alliance continuity amid shifting politics. Pisans were fiercely Ghibelline. They always stayed that, right? They were Roman. They were fully aligned with imperial strategy, and they pursued their, in fact, role in the broader universal policy. They didn't care about the interland in that sense. They wanted to consolidate their maritime dominion, that at this point was really marvelous. In 1158, both Pisa and Genoa defied Frederick Barbarossa's request, however, to transport imperial legates to Sardinia, because the emperor was toying there with establishing a proper kingdom. We discussed this also in the video about Arborea. All right, this was attemptably established, but sort of take some time before the continuity in that realm would be affirmed in throughout the centuries. Nevertheless, this shows how interested the Hohenstaufen were properly in consolidating themselves a Mediterranean dominion via these subjects. The action here, the attitude of Pisa and Genoa is the one of autonomous assertion in maritime affairs, saying, yes, we will, at least especially for Pisa, follow an imperial direction. Genoa was more sort of tendentially wealth, right? But we are still doing that on our own capacity, right? In terms, like, it is some very similar attitude to the one that Lombards displayed against the emperor in their wars against them through the League, the Northern League. They believed that they were the Romans. They believed that they were the free citizens in arms, and therefore they were also, in the sense, noble in arms as long as they could bear them, and with a sense of superiority that is very difficult to understand. Again, especially as I said at the beginning, if you just see these powers about, I don't know, trade, right? They were massive military powers on their own account, and they showed, right? They were okay with aligning with the emperor of this brought them, like in the aforementioned case, more privileges and liberties, but they were not willing to simply give them back. In 1160, 2 Pisan galleys and 4 Saetia, that is fast scout vessels with oar and sail for speed, intercepted Saracen vessels escorting a captured large Genoese merchantman bound for Denia. The Pisans routed the escorts through superior maneuvering, using wind and oar coordination, and brought the prize home, after which Genoese ambassadors secured its peaceful return to avoid escalation into full war as well, because the Pisans wanted sort of to maintain the spoils of war, right? You lost that, you don't know how to handle it to begin with. In 1162, Barbarossa imposed also a truce between Pisa and Genoa himself to stabilize imperial interests in Italy, as we said before. There didn't have to be other perturbances that would make the Italic scene more troubled than it was already. In 1164, at the Parma Diet, the Sardinia question dominated, with Frederick creating Barezone king of the island, paid for by Genoa in an attempt to counter Pisan influence. The point is that altogether they couldn't simply pay off this fee. So the year later, this imperial venture was abandoned, right? But you have actually this very interesting picture where you have Barezone was a judge, right? And they were sometimes peasants themselves, married into the Pisan aristocracy. So it's a complex game, and now it's just a note among the various things. But for telling you how much also Genoa was trying to avert further Pisan growth in power, and how much also the peasants were trying to remain autonomous, as we said before. There was no way to unite the island under a single reign in a realistic way. So the peasants would remain fundamentally undisturbed there. In 1165, Alexander III barely escaped a Pisan naval cruiser before a storm disrupted pursuit. In 1167, this because the peasants were temporarily siding with the emperor, and as you know, he had created an anti-pope, so the Pope traveled, and the peasants had tried to ambush and capture him. In 1167, peasant ships helped the Archbishop of Cologne capture Civitavecchia against the Pope. 8 peasant galleys ascended the Tiber to aid Barbarossa's operations against Rome. Right, there is a siege of the city, and the conquest of this coastal center further north to support the imperial army. Pisan naval contingents provided here critical logistical support for imperial campaigns by ferrying troops and supplying along Italian coasts and participating in riverine assaults themselves, such as at the Tiber advance on Rome, where galley-mounted artillery, the ballista, and boarding parties complemented land forces in breaching defenses through combined operations. In the 1150s, Pisan land and naval forces repelled incursions at Piombino with determined counter-raids that protected the main land port and disrupted enemy shipping in adjacent waters. In 1170, Pisa defeated the Lucchese at Motrone in the hinterland through effective use of terrain, ambushes, and passes, and their more conventional forces. The year later, Pisa allied with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus against Genoese influence to counterbalance rivals. In 1165, you had also the Battle of Saint-Gilles along the Rhone, exemplifying the intense rivalry between Genoa and Pisa, were Genoese allies with the Count of Toulouse, had in fact blockaded Pisan galleys for days in a riverine confrontation. As you know, the Rhone mouth was the water highway for rising up to the French hinterland, and much of the Champagne fair exports to the Mediterranean passed through there, right? So controlling it was a matter of immense economic relevance for these maritime republics. A direct Pisan assault on the Genoese camp inflicted heavy casualties and material losses through surprise, night or dawn attacks and close combat, allowing resumption of provincial trade routes vital for goods flow such as wines, oils, and textiles. All right. So these are, again, very interesting clashes. Sometimes you will not find them written like they're in the footnote of history books, but they're actually pretty important engagements, telling the truth. There's like footnotes in a metaphorical sense, because otherwise there is some literature about it. I mean, they give you a dimension of what this warfare was fundamentally about. How the protection of trade lanes was obviously pivotal. Similar raiding patterns persisted without, in fact, so decisive fleet engagements, focusing on ship captures and coastal disruptions in Sardinia, Corsica, the Tyrrhenian zones through the 1170s. Imagine all the experience, the knowledge they had gained from this theater of operations to wear down opponents economically by targeting merchantman infrastructure. During the 1170s, Pisan troops and ships also intervened in local disputes within the Sardinian judicates of Cagliari and Arborea to safeguard commercial privileges and mining rights against Genoese-backed factions, while squadrons conducted systematic Tyrrhenian patrols in 1174-1175 that countered Genoese privateering through convoy escorts and several successful ship captures near Elba, using superior intelligence from scouts and speed of the Saetia, as we have seen before, which stands for thunderbolts, essentially, bolts. During the 1170-1173 period, following Pisan alignments with Byzantine interests amid Genoese overtures to the emperor, Archbishop Christian of Mainz convened assemblies that ultimately placed Pisa under imperial ban. Right. Here we're still before Legnano, so Barbarossa's Longomanus is still interfering there. As we've seen before, he was just buying the Sardinian kingdom that was paid by the Genoese, but the local judge could not repay the Genoese back, so could not control the island. And at this point, the emperor starts seeing the Pisans a bit as the power to reduce. All right, as at least the Genoese realized that temporarily that they could side with the emperor. So the Pisans were stripped of regalian rights, including the minting privileges that were naturally crucial for such a commercially invested republic, and that represented the ultimate public right, the one of minting coins, right, to properly regulate international trade accordingly, right, certifying also the quality of local metal, precious metal. And this was, again, a punishment for perceived disloyalty toward the empire. In response, Pisan forces allied with Florentine troops yet again. Remember, there's this broader imperial force looming over, so the communes are not much fighting against one another, if not in this particular case at sea, where Genoa and Pisa prevailed. In a otherwise much more complex international scenario, marched against the German garrison stronghold of San Miniato in the hinterland in a show of defiance against imperial overreach. Because there were all German knights garrisoned, billeted here and there to support Barbarossa's policy, mostly concentrated against the Lombards. But Tuscany, it has an interesting role in this. We've seen it also well, in fact, in the videos about Florence and Pisa that we already made. Pisan and Genoese artisans continued to be sought for siege machinery. Towers, mobile castles on wheels for overcoming walls, covered approaches like tortoises or sows to protect sappers digging mines, and engines like trebuchets for hurling heavy projectiles. Following the 1171 alliance with Manuel I Comnenus, Pisan squadrons operated in the Aegean and Ionian seas in the 1180s, providing escort for Byzantine shipping against Norman or Genoese threats through patrols and convoy protection. All right, at this point, the Byzantines, as you know, had would try the invasion of Sicily, right? In agreement also with the papacy, but the enterprise will ultimately fail, right? The Pisans were tempered from their side. Meanwhile, the Age of Crusades is further developing, and there is an important shift from land routes that had been mostly privileged during the First, the Second Crusade toward naval ones. In fact, Pisan naval power projected into the Eastern Mediterranean during the lead-up to the Third Crusade, with squadrons providing transport, blockade support, and resupply for Latin forces. In 1187-1189, Pisan galleys helped relieve pressures on Tyre by disrupting Saladin's supply lines along the Levantine coast through hit-and-run raids, attacking isolated vessels, and convoy interceptions, while contingents under archiepiscopal command joined the broader imperial crusade fort. This is after the reconciliation of Barbarossa with the Italian communes, the Treaty of Constance, and so this sense that a new age has ushered in which Christian forces reunite after the fall of Jerusalem, right? This was all done also, in fact, after the anti-Norman parenthesis coordinating with Sicilian fleets. In 1187, in view of the crusade, St. Gregory VIII had visited Pisa to reconcile the city with Genoa and promote the new expedition in the Holy Land through preaching and negotiations. In 1189, a Tuscan Romagnol contingent commanded by the archbishops of Pisa and Ravenna joined Barbarossa's crusade, specifically. Right? They went with the Germans, essentially. And that's where they operate alongside the Sicilian fleet, because at this point, the Hohenstaufen have seized the southern kingdom with Henry VI's marriage with Constance of Hauteville. The Sicilian fleet was led by Margaritone, who compelled, as we said, Saladin to raise the siege of Tyre through naval pressure, right? Because there you could properly keep supplying the site, and without an adequate fleet, that endeavor was kind of useless. In 1191, Pisan galleys also supported Henry VI's entry into the Norman kingdom during the revolt that had occurred there, and Henry was to seize control, so that the Pisans clashed with Sicilian naval forces during the advance on Naples, using their sophisticated naval expertise. In 1194, Pisan and Genoese fleets accompanied Henry VI's conquest of the south as well. After rapid surrenders across the mainland due to overwhelming force, the combined forces reached Messina, which opened its gates and received extensive privileges as a reward, right? Pisan control of Messina had already been temporarily obtained in 1192, triggering island-wide clashes with local and rival forces, culminating in Genoese gains at Syracuse by 1204, amid privileges granted by the same Henry VI to balance power. These wars were variously led against de facto Tancred of Lecce and all the ramifications of this. These were former Hauteville branches that resisted the transition to the Hohenstaufen, right? And you have figures like Margaritus of Brindisi, as well as a powerful Sicilian admiral and Count of Malta, who served as the primary naval defender of the Norman kingdom against Henry's forces. And also throughout the 1190s, you had these various Sicilian noble cities and ecclesiastical figures, such as those in Palermo, who remained loyal to Tancred's family, even after his demise, resisting to the Hohenstaufen takeover. Right, so this is the moment in which Pisa and Genoa, as we've seen, the Pisans had already been there, kind of. The Genoese had also assisted at some point the Sicilians, but this is probably the moment of breakthrough, the moment in which these maritime republics managed to seize control of the southern Italian ports in great part. in this tendentially favors Pisa because they are Ghibelline, right? And at this point, they're more aligned with the Germans. They're going to stay that, right? The Genoese historically will be sort of more properly aligned, but it depends also on the specific years and specific campaigns. We can't be overly precise about everything because naturally, as you understand, there is a lot, and perhaps I should break these videos into 50 years or even decades to look at everything in detail, but why not? There is also much more detail for brand new videos that can sort of dissect this various chronological sections, better analyze these chronological sections. Treaties with Venice in 1180, especially a non-aggression agreement covering the Tyrrhenian Adriatic to manage overlapping interests, and 1206 renouncing further Adriatic expansion while retaining acquired outlets and serving as an anti-Genoese function, helped Pisa manage broader maritime rivalries through diplomacy. We've seen it also the other day in the video about the rise of the Crown of Aragon, that in this century Venice allies basically with Pisa, with Aragon, because Genoa is actually keeping to mountain power and gradually expanding, consolidating Corsica, and this will eventually be too much for her. They are going to beat later on the Pisans, but this pressure will eventually lead also to the giving up of different routes control and open the Atlantic one, but we're a bit later. All right, so Pisa agrees with Venice to create this anti-Genoese alliance. In the 1190s, Pisan hosts and allies conducted raids and defensive actions around contested inland strong points like Buti or Palaia during fluctuating alliances in Tuscany involving shifting coalitions. In 1198, amid Innocent III's interdict over Pisa's reluctance to join anti-Hohenstaufen alignments during Papal Imperial Wars, a local unrest in Lunigiana, in the north close to Pisa, so subject communities like Bezzano rebel in Pisan favor, leading to joint land sea assaults on Portovenere that were ultimately repulsed by Genoese relief forces. You have all these coastline strongholds being possessed by this or that power. So there's obviously by the end of the century further intensifying warfare because medieval civilization is mounting up, all right, and these policies were probably the vanguard of it. You have their heavy losses in prisoners and lives from the Pisan side during the withdrawal due to coordinated Genoese response. Pisan naval, this is interesting because indeed Innocent III at some point aligns first with the successor Henry VI, that is Philippus Baby and Otto IV, and things get complicated. But again, I just said we can't say everything. We will at some point, but perhaps through, I don't know, Innocent III's policy of what was happening, maybe in Pisan, a standalone video during this very decade. Pisan naval forces in 1195-96 helped secure contest ports such as Gaeta during Henry VI's consolidation in the south through combined fleet landings and garrison reinforcements. In 1200, Pisan galleys and troops supported Markwald of Anweiler's Sicilian campaign on behalf of imperial interests. This is during the minority of Frederick II. Markwald of Anweiler was a German knight who was sent to reaffirm essentially Hohenstaufen power in the south. That's exactly what Innocent III was trying to avoid, like the reconjunction of an Hohenstaufen German power, and so with all the Italic, Burgundian, etc. Dependencies plus Sicily, right? And in fact, the Pisans side against the papacy and in favor of the Hohenstaufen because they want to recover, of course, those massive Sicilian markets and all the enormous agricultural resources, right? Florence will make its fortune civilizationally with the subcontracting of Sicilian grain exports under the Angevins. Like Pisa is doing the same for the Hohenstaufen in a much more terrible situation for Sicily, if anything, for the same Hohenstaufen, because it's a moment of sort of great indecision. Like Frederick II is a minor. You have here strifes that damage also the same Sicilian fabric. The Pisans don't care very much. They're very predatory minded, but they support. Of course, they know that they're going to be chosen by the Hohenstaufen for that specific role. So they They participate in the advance on Palermo, so the capital of the Sicilian kingdom, and subsequent fighting around Monreale that ended in defeat, however, against combined papal and local forces, interestingly enough, because there were local factions, including the costly loss of 500 Pisan defenders in mountain positions due to difficult terrain and superior enemy numbers. Pisan adaptability in coordinating land and sea operations, whether in support of larger imperial endeavors or in defense of the Iranian and Tuscan interests, enabled, as we've seen today, the Republic to maintain its position despite the persistent strategic demand and mounting strategic demands of the period. And so today we appreciated how the military history of Pisa in this period, by this time, the latter half of the 12th century, reveals a consistent pattern of consolidation and defense, driven by the interplay of maritime power through skilled galley fleets, mastery of oar sail tactics, technical expertise in siegecraft with advanced engines, and shipbuilding that produce reliable vessels capable of extended operations, alliances with popes for legitimacy, indulgences, and mediation and emperors for territorial grants and protection, and the unceasing need to protect commercial networks against rival maritime republics like Genoa through raids, diplomacy, and truces, all while managing the grind of regional border wars and naval skirmishes that tested resources but built resilience in crews, commanders, and institutions. You also want to appreciate the Pisan international standing and growing fame. For example, at the Battle of Jaffa in August 1192, Richard of England's force was, as you know, confronting significantly larger Ayyubid army under Saladin. And historical records note that the English king's defense included a contingent of Genoese and Pisan crossbowmen who were essential to holding the line against Ayyub cavalry charges, right? Combined armed tactics with heavy stopping infantry and cavalry as well, counterattacking at some point the Saracen positions. So you have a whole setting, a whole context that here we're just beginning to scratch in the surface, right? The reason why I'm making these videos is that they can hopefully blend as a great saga the entire military history of these cities and their exploit, their sort of political issues, their, as you see here, like the urban fortification, territorial consolidation. These things are all important to properly explain the military culture of these peoples, right? It's really crucial to understand also how deeply entwined European warfare was at this point, how much relevance it has in the bigger picture. And I'm glad that, especially we're talking about Pisa, that I think we made only, there are very few videos on in general. I think, I want to see if I have a playlist already. I actually do, with only 4 videos, and one is also pretty generic. There are the Venetians, the Genoese, etc. for trade. But I'm glad here that we can add a 5th element, and as you understand here, for every century we're going to make more, right? At some point some centuries are probably scarcer. I'm starting from the 13th to 12th because they're denser, then of course like the 14th to 15th as well, but this is properly a moment of exploit, expansion, so the histories are very interesting, right? And as we've seen today, there is really a lot to say that we don't even have all the time in the world to say. I tend to stop before 2 hours and a half because otherwise I have some problems with the audio when I export the video, that it may sort of be cut at the end. So I think this was a pretty good video overall, and it complements well with the one we made about 11th century Genoa, and so we're going to make 12th, 13th for that as well. And there is really a lot here to browse in terms of sources. We will make definitely some videos about each and every expedition that we looked at here. The most famous ones, one of the Balearic Islands, for example, is quite crucial. There are all these interventions in the Levant, and all this more properly Tyrrhenian warfare in Tuscany, also in the hinterland in Sardinia, in Corsica against the Genoese, then the Ligurian Sea, in Provence, as we've seen as well. So there is really a lot there that it's a bit difficult not to be completely fascinated with. I'm really glad that, again, we're the only channel, I presume, that does this stuff, this level of depth. So I sometimes wonder, again, what's because it seems like with AI, everybody should or could sort of get there. Here I see Pisan warfare, there is literally nothing. So hopefully this will bring more views to the wall. But I'm really glad that we are we're, if anything, making these videos, because as you understand, they also blend pretty well with what we have done so far already, right? We are really at this point in Schwerpunkt's history covering medieval warfare in unprecedented detail. We have expanded also with modern contemporary warfare. These specials have been really useful, probably to back up like the entire sort of reach of Schwerpunkt, and we are definitely succeeding. Like summer, usually July, August, does not bring many views, but overall, the more we do, and I presume like in September, October, if we continue like this, there's going to be a big jump, big step forward. This has been the case every year, right? And obviously, the more we do, the better it is. I have also, as I can see here, a Tuscan warfare playlist already. Yeah, medieval Tuscan warfare, just a couple of videos. Well, this is definitely going to complement it well. So we have actually to do a lot, because there are also lots of very interesting battles, right? For Lombard warfare, probably we didn't make too much as well. We made lots of videos about Tuscan history. This is for sure, and this is really a very positive thing. But we have to vary in quickly. Like it's this is the prerogative of the specials. Like while the lottery extraction, we don't even have a medieval Lombard warfare playlist. We must create one now. I mean, yeah, this is exactly what I mean. We have really a lot, but we have to refine it. We have to make it more accessible, better order, and etc. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.